A crime where cause followed effect. Logic itself was shattered. Welcome to Holmes Mystery. I am your host, Lucien Moreau. Comment where you're watching from below. I appreciate every single one of you. Let's begin. It was close upon 6 o'clock when our hansom turned from the broader thoroughfare into a long, sombre avenue lined with bare elms, whose blackened branches writhed above us in the fog like the limbs of some giant and half-seen creature. At the end of this spectral approach there loomed the dim frontage of Ashbourne House, its many windows glowing faintly through the vapour, and its wide Georgian face wearing, even at that distance, an aspect of dignity touched by desolation. Holmes had spoken scarcely a dozen words during the drive. He had sunk into one of those profound silences which, with him, invariably denoted a mind working at the highest pressure. Once only he broke it. "You observed our client's cuffs, Watson?" "I cannot say that I did." "Frayed, though his coat was excellent, a man preserving appearances on diminishing means. His left sleeve was marked with a faint streak of red sealing wax, and his right forefinger with printer's ink. He had left his office in haste, but not before handling documents of consequence. A solicitor, as he said, but one engaged at the moment in affairs of unusual urgency." "You infer, then, that Lord Ashbourne's death touches upon some important legal matter?" Holmes smiled faintly in the darkness. "I infer that Mr. Edmund Carraway believes it does. Whether he is correct remains to be seen." Before I could pursue the subject further, the carriage drew up beneath the portico. A footman with a grave face admitted us instantly, as though our arrival had been expected with impatience. We were shown not to the study itself, but to a morning room on the right of the hall, where Inspector Lestrade stood upon the hearthrug, hands clasped behind his back, and his sharp, ferret-like features sharpened yet further by professional irritation. "Mr. Holmes," said he, with that mixture of relief and reserve which my friend so often inspired in the official mind, "I thought this one might tempt you." "It has already done so," Holmes returned. "You appear dissatisfied, Lestrade." "I do not like cases that look theatrical," said the inspector shortly. "They generally mean either a fool's trick or a clever rogue. How in this instance I cannot yet say which. That is already an advance upon the average police conclusion." Lestrade permitted himself the shadow of a grin. "You shall judge for yourself. The body remains as found. I delayed nothing beyond what decency required." "Excellent. But first, the household." Lestrade glanced at a notebook in his hand. "Miss Eleanor Ashbourne is upstairs with her maid, badly shaken but composed. Mr. Julian Mercer is in the library. Colonel Rook is in the smoking-room and has already made himself twice as objectionable as any innocent man has a right to be. The housekeeper, Mrs. Dalrymple, remains available if needed." As to the facts, Lord Ashbourne was discovered at 2:30 in his study by his daughter. The door was locked, it was forced in, and he was found dead at his desk. "And the witnesses who saw him alive at 2:20, Holmes asked. All three have repeated the same point with tiresome confidence. "Then let us begin where all sound inquiries should begin," said Holmes. "At the centre, not the circumference." Lestrade led us across the hall and down a short passage panelled in dark oak. The study door, a solid and old-fashioned one, still bore the splintered mark where it had been forced near the lock. Holmes paused only long enough to examine the damage with a rapid glance before entering. The room was of moderate size, heavily furnished, and lined on two sides with bookshelves. A coal fire had sunk low in the grate, yet the air retained a close, faintly metallic odour, which I, as a medical man, had learned to associate too readily with sudden death. A large writing desk stood near the centre, its green shaded lamp casting a concentrated pool of yellow light. Behind it, in a high-backed chair, sat the dead man. Lord Ashbourne was an elderly gentleman of spare frame and aquiline features, his grey hair brushed neatly back from a broad and scholarly brow. Had it not been for the dreadful wound at the throat and the dark staining of his collar, he might have been taken for one asleep in an attitude of stern reflection. One hand rested upon the desk blotter, the other had dropped to the arm of the chair. His expression, even in death, preserved something of severe astonishment. I stepped forward instinctively, but Holmes laid a restraining hand upon my sleeve. "One moment, Watson. Let the room speak before the body does." He moved in a slow circuit, saying nothing. His eyes travelled from the windows to the hearth, from the desk to the carpet, from the bookshelves to the single lamp. The curtains were half drawn, the windows were fastened. A decanter and glass stood untouched upon a side table. On the desk lay a neat arrangement of papers, a silver letter opener, a pen tray, and a carriage clock beneath a glass dome. Holmes stopped at that last object. "Curious," he murmured. Lestrade shifted. "You noticed it, then?" "The fact that it has stopped? Certainly, at 20 minutes past 2. That seemed to support the witness accounts." Holmes bent lower, but did not touch it. "Support them or invite them?" I knelt meanwhile beside the chair and conducted as discreet an examination as circumstances allowed. The wound, as Carraway had said, was narrow, clean, and singularly precise. See, it had been inflicted with a sharp instrument of fine edge. Death, in all probability, had been very rapid, yet the absence of arterial spatter beyond the immediate staining struck me as unusual. "Well, Watson," said Holmes, "the injury is unquestionably mortal. The coroner's estimate of 2:30 might, I think, be somewhat refined, but not radically challenged. The body is cool, though not markedly so. Rigour has begun. I should place death in the neighbourhood of 2 o'clock to 2:30, as reported." Holmes nodded, though his gaze remained upon the desk. "Noted. And now let us have the witnesses precisely as they stand in sequence." Lestrade consulted his notes again. At 10 minutes past 2, Mrs. Dalrymple took tea to the door of the study. Lord Ashbourne called from within that he was engaged and was not to be disturbed. At roughly 1:15, Mercer says he passed through the hall and heard Lord Ashbourne coughing inside the room. At 20 minutes past, Colonel Rooke, crossing the passage, heard Lord Ashbourne speak, just a few words, through the closed door. At the same time, Miss Eleanor Ashbourne, descending the stairs, saw the light beneath the study door and heard her father say, "That will do for the present." At 2:30, she returned, received no answer, found the door locked, and raised the alarm. Holmes straightened. So 3 witnesses do not in fact see the dead man alive at 20 minutes past 2. They hear a voice, observe a light, and interpret both in one direction. Lestrade frowned. Miss Ashbourne states she recognized her father's voice, as most daughters would, provided they expected to hear it. That remark appeared to nettle the inspector, but Holmes was already upon another trail. He had drawn a chair close to the desk and was studying its surface with minute attention. Suddenly he picked up the silver letter opener, weighed it, and replaced it exactly where he had found it. "Not the weapon," said he. "Obviously," Lestrade returned. "It is blunt. Nothing is obvious until tested. You have searched the room? Every inch of it. And found no blade?" "Nothing." Holmes sank to one knee and examined the carpet beneath the desk. Then, to my surprise, he stretched himself full length upon the floor and peered beneath the lowest shelf of the bookcase. "What do you make of that, Watson?" "I see nothing." "Precisely. Even yet there should be dust." He rose in one lithe movement and crossed to the fireplace. Upon the mantel stood a row of small bronzes, a clock, and 2 candlesticks. One candlestick, I observed, had a slight smear upon its stem. Holmes took out his lens. Wax? Yes, but not from this room. At that instant, a faint sound came from the passage beyond, the creak of a board, followed by the soft closing of a door somewhere deeper in the house. Lestrade made for the entrance, but Holmes raised his hand. No, let them move freely a little longer. A household under strain reveals more when it believes itself unwatched. He turned back to the dead man, and for the first time a curious change came over his face. The detached brightness in his eyes deepened into something graver, almost troubled. "Lestrade," said he quietly.
"Or you told me this case was theatrical. I think you have understated it. Someone here has not merely committed murder. They have arranged events in a sequence meant to be accepted because it flatters habit." "You mean the witnesses were prepared?" "I mean," said Holmes, "that before this night is over, we must learn whether the voice behind that locked door belonged to Lord Ashbourne at all." Lestrade regarded Holmes with narrowed eyes, as though uncertain whether to treat the remark as insight or provocation. "You suggest impersonation," he said. "I suggest nothing as yet," Holmes replied evenly. "I merely question the assumption that has thus far gone unchallenged, that the continuity of voice implies the continuity of life." "But 3 people heard what they expected to hear?" Holmes interrupted softly. It is a most common human error." He turned abruptly toward the door. "Come, Watson, we must speak with Miss Ashbourne while her impressions are still vivid. Inspector, I trust you will join us." We were conducted upstairs by the same grave-faced footman, whose composure I could not help but admire under the circumstances. The corridors above were wide and dimly lit, the gas lamps turned low, so that shadows gathered thickly in the corners. A sense of oppression hung over the house, as though the very walls were aware of the disturbance within them. Miss Eleanor Ashbourne received us in a small sitting-room adjoining her bedchamber. She rose as we entered, and I was struck at once by the quiet dignity of her bearing. She was a young woman of perhaps 25, pale now from recent shock,
Yet composed in a manner that spoke of strong character. Her dark eyes, though reddened, were steady, and her voice, when she spoke, did not tremble. "Mr. Holmes," she said, inclining her head, "Mr. Carroway informed me that you might come. I am grateful." Holmes bowed slightly. "Miss Ashbourne, I regret that we meet under such circumstances. I shall be as brief as possible, but I must beg your exact recollection of certain moments this afternoon. I will tell you whatever I can. You last saw your father alive at what hour?" "Shortly before 2 o'clock," she replied. "He was in his study, as usual. We spoke for a few minutes. He appeared preoccupied, but not distressed. Did he mention any business or any person who might have caused him concern?" She hesitated. "He had received a letter earlier in the day. I cannot say from whom."
But I know it affected him." He was not himself afterward. Holmes's eyes flickered briefly. "You saw the letter?" "No, he placed it in his desk." "Very good. Now, you state that at 20 minutes past 2 you heard his voice?" "Yes. I was descending the stairs. I saw the light beneath the study door, and I heard him say, 'That will do for the present.'" "Those were the exact words?" "I believe so." "And you are certain it was your father's voice?" She met his gaze steadily. "I have known his voice all my life, Mr. Holmes." Holmes inclined his head. "Naturally. Yet permit me one further question. Did anything in his tone strike you as unusual?" For the first time, uncertainty touched her expression. I cannot say. It was brief, perhaps a little curt. but he could be so when engaged. Indeed, and you did not attempt to enter? No.
He had instructed us not to disturb him. Until 2:30 when you returned? Yes. I knocked, but there was no answer. I tried the handle and found it locked. That is when I called for assistance. Holmes was silent for a moment, studying her with that peculiar intensity of his, which seemed to weigh not only words, but the spaces between them. "You have been most helpful, Miss Ashbourne," he said at last. "One final point. Was your father accustomed to locking his door?" "Occasionally, when dealing with confidential matters." Holmes bowed again. "Thank you." As we withdrew, I could not help but glance back. She had resumed her seat, her hands clasped tightly before her, her composure intact but strained, like a finely drawn wire. In the corridor, Lestrade spoke in a low voice. "A straightforward account. Aye, if you ask me." "Straightforward, yes," Holmes murmured, "but not necessarily simple." We were next shown to the library where Mr. Julian Mercer awaited us. He was a thin, precise-looking man of perhaps 35, with carefully parted hair and an air of nervous propriety. He rose at once, adjusting his cuffs as though to steady himself. "Mr. Holmes, Inspector." Holmes wasted no time. "You passed the study door at approximately 2:15? "Yes." "And what did you observe?" "Nothing, sir. That is to say, I heard Lord Ashbourne cough within, a dry, habitual cough. It reassured me that he was occupied as usual." "You did not speak to him?" "No, he disliked interruptions." Holmes nodded. "And prior to that?" "I had been in the library."
Sorting correspondence? Did you see anyone enter or leave the study?" "No one." Holmes' gaze sharpened. "You are quite certain of that?" "Entirely." "Yet you admit that the door was closed?" "Yes." "Then your certainty rests not upon observation, but upon assumption." Mercer flushed slightly. I suppose that is so." Holmes turned away as though the matter no longer interested him. But I, who knew him well, recognized the significance he attached to such admissions. Our final interview was with Colonel Sebastian Rook, whom we found in the smoking room. He was a large, powerfully built man with a weathered face and a heavy moustache, whose manner combined impatience with a certain rough candour. "Well, Holmes," he said bluntly, "I suppose you've come to untangle this damn nonsense." Holmes regarded him coolly. "I've come to understand it," Rook snorted. "You'll have your work cut out. I was within 10 feet of the door at 20 minutes past 2. Heard Ashbourne's voice plain as day. No trick about that." "What did he say?" "Something about no delay. I didn't catch it clearly, but it was him, no mistake." "You are familiar with Lord Ashbourne's voice?" "Of course I am. Known the man for 20 years. Holmes clasped his hands behind his back. "And yet you did not enter?" "Why should I? The door was shut, and I had no business with him at that moment." Holmes nodded slowly. "Quite so. No business at that moment." There was a pause, during which the Colonel lit a cigar with unnecessary force. "You think one of us did it?" he said suddenly. Holmes's expression did not change. "I think, Colonel, that the truth lies somewhere within this house."
Whether it implicates one of you or all of you remains to be discovered." Rook gave a harsh laugh. "Well, you'll find no shortage of theories, but you won't change the facts. The man was alive when I heard him." Holmes turned toward the door. "Facts, Colonel, are like grains of sand. It is their arrangement that forms the desert or the mirage." As we left the room, Lestrade exhaled sharply. "Well, 3 witnesses, 3 confirmations. You cannot dismiss them all." Holmes paused at the head of the stairs, his face half in shadow. "I do not dismiss them," he said quietly. I rearranged them. And what does that give you? Holmes' eyes gleamed faintly. A voice without a body, a death without a weapon, and a sequence of events that depends entirely upon the acceptance of a single moment, 20 minutes past 2. He began to descend. "Oh, come, Watson, we return to the study. There is one assumption yet untested, and until it is broken, this entire case remains a carefully constructed illusion." The study appeared unchanged upon our return, yet the very stillness of it seemed now to press more heavily upon the senses, as though the room itself resisted the scrutiny to which Holmes was about to subject it. The lamp still burned steadily upon the desk, casting its narrow circle of light, while the shadows beyond lay thick and undisturbed. Holmes closed the door softly behind us and stood for a moment with his back to it, his eyes moving slowly about the chamber. "Let us begin again," he said quietly. "Not with what we have been told, but with what we can prove." Lestrade folded his arms. "You have already seen everything there is to see?" "On the contrary," Holmes returned. We have thus far seen only what was intended to be seen." He crossed at once to the desk, and without hesitation lifted the glass dome from the carriage clock. The delicate ticking, which I had not previously noticed, ceased abruptly as he arrested the mechanism with a deft touch. 20 minutes past 2, he murmured. "A most obliging time." "You think it was tampered with?" Lestrade asked. "I think it was arranged," said Holmes. "Observe, Watson." He turned the clock slightly, revealing its back. A small access panel had been opened and imperfectly closed again. Holmes's long fingers worked it free, and he peered within. "There has been interference here, quite recent. The spring has been checked deliberately, not broken but restrained." Lestrade stepped forward. "Then the time is false?" "The time is presented," Holmes corrected. "Whether it is false depends upon what purpose it serves." He replaced the clock exactly as he had found it and turned his attention to the desk itself. One by one he examined the papers laid out upon it, not reading them in full, but scanning their arrangement, their edges, their relation to one another. "Neatness," he said, "almost too neat. A man interrupted in the midst of work rarely leaves such order behind him." "Perhaps he had finished," I suggested. "Perhaps," Holmes allowed. "And yet—" He stopped abruptly and bent closer to the blotter. With his lens he studied a faint indentation upon the surface. "Watson, your eye, if you please." I leaned in. At first I saw nothing, but gradually the impression resolved itself, a series of shallow marks as though a sheet of paper had once lain there, bearing writing that had been pressed into the blotter beneath. "A missing document?" I said. "Precisely. And one removed with care, for there is no tearing, no disorder." Lestrade's impatience showed. "Documents go missing in every case. That proves nothing." "It proves," said Holmes, "that something of importance was here and is no longer. Combine that with Miss Ashbourne's mention of a letter received earlier in the day, and we begin to perceive a pattern." He moved now to the chair in which the dead man sat and examined its position relative to the desk. "Curious," he murmured again. "What now?" Lestrade demanded. "The angle. Lord Ashbourne is seated slightly askew, as though he had turned, either to address someone or to reach for something not directly before him." "That is natural enough." "Entirely. But then we must ask, where is that something?" Holmes's gaze swept the room once more sharply now. He strode to the bookcase he had earlier inspected, and again lowered himself to examine the space beneath it. "You recall, Watson, the absence of dust?" "Yes." "Then let us see what has replaced it." He extended his hand into the shadowed recess and drew out, not an object, but a faint trace upon his fingertips. He held them up to the light. "Metal filings," he said softly. Lestrade stared. "From what?" "That is precisely the question." Holmes rose and crossed swiftly to the fireplace. He took up the candlestick with the smeared stem and held it closer to the lamp. "This wax is not from the candles here. It is of a darker composition, possibly sealing wax." "Oh, and yet why should sealing wax be applied to a candlestick?" "To fix something?" I ventured. Holmes' eyes flashed approval. "Excellent, Watson. To fix or to steady." He replaced the candlestick and stood very still, his head slightly bowed, as though listening to some inward argument. "A clock that has been arrested," he said at last. "A voice heard but not seen, a document removed, metal filings beneath a shelf, wax applied where it does not belong." Lestrade gave a short, exasperated laugh. "You make it sound like a conjurer's table." "An apt comparison," Holmes replied, "for we are dealing with an illusion, one designed to impose a sequence upon events that did not occur in that order." He turned suddenly to me. "Watson, you examined the wound. Tell me, did anything strike you as inconsistent with the supposed time of death?" I hesitated. "The lack of extensive arterial spray, perhaps, though that might be explained by the position of the body." "Or by the position of the body at the moment of injury," Holmes said. Lestrade's expression hardened. "You mean he was not seated there when he was killed?" "I mean," said Holmes, "that we must not assume he died where he was found." A silence fell at that, broken only by the faint hiss of the gas lamp. "But the locked door," Lestrade began. "A device," Holmes said curtly. "Nothing more. A locked door proves only that someone wished it to be locked." He moved toward the window and examined the fastenings. They were secure, the latches firm, the glass unbroken. "No exit here," he murmured, "which leaves us with entry and preparation." He turned back to the desk, his expression now one of intense concentration. "The key to this case lies not in what occurred at 20 minutes past 2, he said slowly, but in what occurred before it, and what was arranged to appear as though it occurred after." Lestrade shook his head. "You are twisting the timeline." "I am restoring it," Holmes replied. At that moment there came a sudden knock at the door. The footman entered, visibly unsettled. "Beg pardon, gentlemen," he said, "but there has been another development." Holmes' eyes sharpened instantly. "Yes?" "A message has just arrived for Mr. Mercer. It was delivered by hand, and the boy who brought it says he was instructed to ensure it reached the house without delay." Holmes stepped forward. At what time was it sent?" The footman hesitated. "It is marked, sir. 2 o'clock." Holmes and Lestrade exchanged a glance. "Bring it here," Holmes said. As the servant withdrew, Holmes turned to us, his voice low, but charged with a new intensity. "Now, gentlemen, we may at last begin to see how the sequence was broken, and more importantly, why someone went to such elaborate lengths to ensure that we would not." The footman returned within moments, bearing upon a small silver tray a single folded envelope. Its presence, so slight and unassuming, seemed nevertheless to alter the very atmosphere of the room. Holmes took it without a word, holding it up to the lamplight before breaking the seal. "Addressed to Mr. Julian Mercer," he said. "Hand-delivered, you say?" "Yes, sir," the servant replied. "A boy, no more than 12.
"And he would not give his name?" Holmes nodded. "That will do." When the man had withdrawn, Holmes opened the envelope and removed its contents, a brief note written in a firm but hurried hand. His eyes moved rapidly across the lines. Then he passed it to Lestrade. "Well?" said the inspector. Lestrade read aloud. The matter cannot be delayed further. You must act at once. All depends upon your discretion. Burn this. There was no signature. Lestrade looked up. A vague enough instruction, but suggestive. Highly so, Holmes murmured. And its timing is most instructive. Sent, as we are told, at 2 o'clock, yet delivered only now. Perhaps the boy was delayed? Perhaps, Holmes echoed. Or perhaps the delay was intentional. I took the note from Lestrade and examined it more closely. The paper was of good quality, though unmarked. The ink,
however, struck me as uneven, as though the writer had paused more than once while composing it. Holmes, I said, the phrasing, the matter cannot be delayed further, suggests urgency already in progress. Whatever this concerns was not initiated at 2 o'clock, but earlier. Holmes inclined his head. An excellent observation, Watson. You see how each fragment begins to align, if only we resist the temptation to force them prematurely into place. Lestrade tapped the paper impatiently. Then let us hear your alignment. This note is addressed to Mercer. You think he is involved? Holmes did not answer at once. Instead, he crossed to the desk and laid the note beside the blotter, aligning it carefully with the faint indentation we had earlier observed. Note the dimensions, he said. The missing document was of similar size. It is not improbable that both were written upon the same sheet or by the same hand. Lestrade leaned closer. You think this was written here? In this room? I think, said Holmes, that this room was the stage upon which several actions were performed, some genuine, others contrived. The difficulty lies in distinguishing between them. He turned abruptly toward the door. We must see Mercer again, and this time with the note in question. We found the secretary precisely where we had left him, though his composure now appeared strained to the point of collapse. His eyes flickered at once to the paper in Holmes's hand. That has come for you, I believe, said Holmes, extending it. Mercer hesitated before taking it. His fingers trembled slightly as he unfolded the note, and I observed that he read it twice before speaking.
I do not understand, he said. Who could have sent this? That is precisely what we hope you will tell us, Holmes replied. I assure you I have no knowledge of it. None at all? None. Holmes watched him steadily. You were in the library at 2 o'clock? Yes. And remained there until after past? Yes. Alone? Mercer hesitated. Yes. Holmes's gaze did not waver. And yet someone believed it necessary to send you a message at that very hour, urging immediate action upon which all depends. Does that strike you as entirely coincidental? Mercer's composure faltered further. I cannot explain it. No, said Holmes softly, but you may yet assist us. He took the note back and held it near the secretary's face. You see the phrase burn this? A common precaution, yet the note was not burned. Instead,
it was delivered late into a house already under investigation. That suggests either remarkable incompetence or deliberate design. Lestrade stepped forward. You think the sender wanted it found? I think the sender wished to ensure that it arrived after the event to which it refers, Holmes said. And that is a very different matter. Mercer stared at him. You mean it was meant to mislead? Holmes did not answer directly. Instead, he changed tack with disconcerting abruptness. Tell me, Mr. Mercer, are you familiar with mechanical devices? The question seemed to catch the man entirely off guard. Mechanical devices? I know more than any ordinary person. Not even small ones. Clockwork, perhaps? Mercer shook his head. No. Holmes studied him for a moment longer, then turned away. Oh, very well. As we withdrew once more into the corridor, Lestrade spoke in a low voice. He's hiding something. Undoubtedly, Holmes replied, but whether it is guilt or fear remains to be determined. And the note? A fragment of the larger design, said Holmes, placed precisely where it would exert the greatest influence upon our interpretation. He descended the stairs slowly, his expression thoughtful. Consider, Watson, he continued, the sequence as it has been presented to us. A letter received earlier in the day, a man alive at 2, witnesses confirming his presence at 20 minutes past, death discovered at 1/2 past, and now a message urging immediate action at the very hour in question. It forms a chain, I said. Indeed. But a chain may bind, or it may deceive. We had reached the study once more. Holmes paused upon the threshold, his hand resting lightly upon the damaged door. This lock, he said, is central to the illusion. It suggests isolation, finality, an event contained within a single, uninterrupted space. And you believe that to be false? Holmes looked back at me, and there was in his eyes a glint of something almost fierce. I believe, Watson, that the crime did not occur within this room at all, not in the manner we are meant to suppose. Lestrade stared. Then where? Holmes pushed the door open and stepped inside. That, he said quietly, is the question upon which everything now depends. He crossed at once to the far wall, where the bookcase stood in shadow, and began once more to examine the lower shelves with minute attention. His fingers traced the wood, pausing at intervals as though following some invisible line. At last he straightened. Yes, he murmured. It is as I suspected. What is? I asked. Holmes turned toward us, his face alight with that rare and dangerous certainty which I had learned to both admire and fear. The sequence has not merely been broken, he said, it has been reversed. And with that, he reached toward the side of the bookcase and pressed, very gently, upon a point which, to my eye, appeared no different from the rest. For a moment, nothing occurred, and I confess I felt a fleeting sense of anticlimax. Then there came a faint, almost imperceptible click, so soft that it might easily have escaped notice altogether, and a narrow section of the bookcase shifted inward by perhaps 1/2 inch. Lestrade uttered a sharp exclamation and stepped forward. But Holmes raised a restraining hand. Gently, he said, these devices are seldom constructed to reward impatience. With delicate pressure, he drew the panel outward. It swung upon concealed hinges, revealing behind it a narrow recess, no more than 2 feet in depth, yet extending the full height of the shelving. Within, the darkness lay thick, but Holmes took up the desk lamp and directed its beam inside. The effect was immediate and striking. The recess was not empty. A narrow ledge had been fitted within it at about waist height, and upon that ledge rested a small, intricate apparatus, metallic in construction, with a series of fine springs and levers, and a coiled length of wire attached to what appeared to be a diaphragm or membrane. Lestrade stared.
What in heaven's name? Holmes set the lamp carefully upon the edge of the opening and leaned closer, his expression one of keen satisfaction. A voice, he said quietly, or rather, the imitation of one. I felt a sudden tightening in my chest as the implication struck me. You mean this contrivance produced the voice that was heard at the door? Holmes nodded. A simple mechanical device, though cleverly concealed. Observe the diaphragm, thin, flexible, and positioned to resonate when set in motion. The wire connects to a spring mechanism which, when released, would cause a vibration sufficient to produce a crude but recognizable sound. Lestrade frowned. But it could not speak words. Not with clarity, no, Holmes agreed. But it need not do so. A few indistinct syllables, shaped by expectation, are often sufficient.
or the mind supplies what the ear cannot fully discern. He reached carefully into the recess and examined the mechanism more closely, though he did not yet remove it. Note the metal filings we observed earlier. They are the residue of adjustment, recent adjustment at that. And the wax upon the candlestick? Likely used to secure part of this apparatus temporarily while it was being calibrated. Lestrade shook his head. Then the voice heard at 20 minutes past 2. Was not Lord Ashbourne's at all, Holmes finished. It was this device, activated at a predetermined moment. I could not help but glance toward the door, recalling Miss Ashbourne's certainty, the Colonel's confidence, Mercer's quiet assurance. But they all believed it to be him, I said. Because they expected it to be him, Holmes replied. Aye, they heard a sound from within the room, a sound approximating a voice, and their minds completed the illusion. It is a subtle trick, but a powerful one. Lestrade's expression hardened. Then the witnesses were deceived. Not necessarily deceived in the conscious sense, Holmes said. They reported what they believed they perceived. The deception lay in the arrangement of circumstances. He straightened and at last withdrew the apparatus, holding it up to the light. It was, as he had said, delicately made, far beyond the crude improvisation of an amateur. This required skill, he continued. Mechanical knowledge, precision, and time. It was not constructed in haste. Then it must belong to someone in the house, Lestrade said. How no outsider could have installed it without being seen. Precisely. Holmes replaced the device upon the ledge for the moment and allowed the panel to remain open. Now we may reconsider the sequence, he said. The witnesses hear a voice at 20 minutes past 2. That moment becomes fixed in their minds as proof that Lord Ashbourne was alive. Yet in truth, that sound was produced independently of him, by this mechanism. Which means, I said slowly, that he may have been dead already. Holmes inclined his head, or at least no longer capable of speech. Lestrade's brow furrowed. But the locked door was part of the same illusion, Holmes replied. A closed room, a voice within, a fixed time. Together they create the impression of an uninterrupted sequence. Break any one of those elements, and the entire construction collapses. He turned back to the desk, his movements now more rapid, more decisive. If Lord Ashbourne was already dead before 20 minutes past 2, then the true time of death must lie earlier. The mechanical device serves to shift that time forward, to create an artificial continuity. But why? Lestrade demanded. What advantage does that give the murderer? Holmes paused, his hand resting upon the blotter. To provide an alibi, he said, or rather, to extend one. The words seemed to hang in the air. Consider, he continued, if death is believed to have occurred at 20 minutes past 2, then anyone demonstrably elsewhere at that time is cleared. But if death occurred earlier, before that moment, then the field of suspicion alters entirely. Lestrade's eyes widened slightly.
Oh, you mean someone who appears to have an alibi? Does not? Exactly. A silence followed, during which the implications of this revelation settled upon us. At length I spoke. Then the question becomes, who had both the knowledge to construct such a device and the opportunity to place it here before the crime? Holmes smiled faintly. Ah, Watson, that is no longer the question. We have already encountered the answer. Lestrade turned sharply. You have? Holmes gestured toward the apparatus. This is not merely mechanical, it is precise. The calibration of the spring, the positioning of the diaphragm, the timing of the release, these are not the work of an untrained hand. And we have in this house a man who has denied precisely such knowledge when asked directly. Mercer, Lestrade said at once. Perhaps, Holmes replied. But denial,
In itself is not proof. It is merely an indication that we have touched upon something he wishes to conceal. He closed the panel gently, restoring the bookcase to its original appearance. For the moment, we shall leave it undisturbed. It will serve us better as a hidden truth than as an exposed one. Lestrade looked dissatisfied. You would not confront him at once? Holmes shook his head. Not yet. We have uncovered the method, but not the motive, nor the precise sequence of actions. To move prematurely would be to risk driving the culprit into silence, or worse. He turned toward the door, his expression once more composed, though I could detect beneath it a growing intensity. Come, Watson, Inspector, the illusion has been pierced, but the pattern remains incomplete. Or we must now determine not only how the sequence was broken, but who stood to gain by breaking it. As we stepped back into the dim corridor, I could not help but feel that we had crossed an invisible threshold. The case, which had begun as a puzzle of impossibility, had resolved itself into something far more unsettling, a deliberate manipulation of perception itself. And somewhere within that house, the mind that had conceived it was still at work. Holmes did not at once direct us toward another interview, as I had expected. Instead, he paused midway along the corridor and stood motionless, his head slightly inclined, as though listening not to any sound, but to the echo of his own deductions. The dim gaslight cast long shadows across his face, sharpening the angles of it until he appeared almost ascetic in his concentration. We must not allow ourselves to be drawn too quickly toward Mercer, he said at last. It is the obvious path, and therefore the most likely to have been anticipated. Lestrade gave a short grunt. He denied knowledge of mechanical devices. That alone proves only that he is cautious, Holmes interjected. A guilty man may lie. An innocent one may also lie, if he believes the truth will implicate him unjustly. Then you think he is protecting someone? I think, said Holmes, that he is protecting something. Whether that be a person, a secret, or his own position remains to be seen. He resumed walking, but instead of returning to the principal rooms, he turned down a narrower passage toward the rear of the house. Where are we going? I asked. To the servants' quarters, Holmes replied. The machinery of a household is often more revealing than its ornament. We found Mrs. Dalrymple in a small, orderly room near the kitchen, seated stiffly by the fire as though awaiting summons. She rose at once as we entered, her manner composed but watchful. You wish to speak with me, sir? Holmes inclined his head. If you please, you took tea to Lord Ashbourne at 2:10. Yes, sir. And you did not enter? No, sir. He called from within that he was not to be disturbed. You are certain it was his voice? She hesitated only briefly. Yes, sir. Holmes observed her closely. You have served in this house long? Nearly 15 years. Then you would know his habits well. I should hope so, sir. Holmes nodded. Tell me, was it his custom to receive visitors in the study during the afternoon? Occasionally, sir. On business. Was any such visitor expected today? Not to my knowledge. Holmes' gaze sharpened. And yet you carried tea for one? For one, sir, as always. Did you notice anything unusual when you approached the door? Mrs. Dalrymple considered. No, sir. Only that the door was closed, as it often was. No sound within? None, sir, until he spoke. Holmes was silent for a moment. You are a careful woman, Mrs. Dalrymple, he said. I believe you observe more than you say. She met his gaze steadily. I say what I know, sir. Then allow me to ask what you noticed. A faint tightening passed over her features. "The lamp was already lit, sir," she said slowly, though it was not yet dark. Holmes's eyes flickered. "And is that unusual?" "Yes, sir. Lord Ashbourne preferred daylight when it was sufficient." "Thank you." We withdrew, and Holmes closed the door behind us with quiet precision. "The lamp," he said, "lit before 2. That is significant." "In what way?" Lestrade asked. "It suggests preparation," Holmes replied. "A controlled environment, light where it is not yet required, a man arranging his stage." "Or someone arranging it for him," I suggested. Holmes glanced at me approvingly. "Just so, Watson." He turned then toward the back staircase, ascending it with swift, silent steps until we reached a landing that overlooked the main hall. From there, one could observe movement below without being readily seen. Holmes leaned lightly upon the banister. "Now we wait," he said. "For what?" Lestrade demanded. "For the next move," Holmes replied. It was some minutes before that move came. At length we heard the soft tread of footsteps below and saw Mr. Julian Mercer emerge from the library, the note still in his hand. He paused in the hall, glancing about him with evident unease, then moved quickly toward the study. Holmes's eyes narrowed. "He returns to the centre," he murmured. "As I expected." We descended at once, though with care to avoid detection, and reached the passage just as Mercer entered the study and closed the door behind him. Holmes raised a finger for silence and moved to the door. From within came no sound. After a brief pause, he turned the handle sharply and pushed it open. Mercer stood near the desk, his back half turned, the note crumpled in his hand. At our sudden entrance, he started violently. "Mr. Holmes, I—" Holmes stepped forward, his gaze fixed upon the man. "You came here for a reason," he said quietly. "Pray do not trouble to invent one." Mercer swallowed.
"I wished to see the room again, or to remove something you fear may be discovered." The man's face drained of colour. "I assure you—" Holmes raised a hand. "Enough. You have already told us you possess no knowledge of mechanical devices, and yet you return, alone, to the very room in which such a device has been concealed." Mercer stared at him in shock. "A device?" Holmes crossed to the bookcase and with a single movement opened the hidden panel once more. The apparatus gleamed faintly within. Mercer's reaction was immediate and unmistakable. His eyes widened and he took an involuntary step backward. I have never seen that before." Holmes watched him intently. "No," he said softly. "Then you will have no difficulty explaining why you came here to retrieve it?" "I did not," Mercer cried. I swear it. I knew nothing of it." Lestrade stepped forward. "You are in a difficult position, Mr. Mercer." "I am innocent," the man insisted. "I came only because of that note. I thought—" "You thought what?" Holmes pressed. Mercer hesitated, then spoke in a lower voice. "I thought it might relate to the letter Lord Ashbourne received this morning." Holmes's expression sharpened. "You have not mentioned this before." I didn't think it relevant." "On the contrary," Holmes said, "it may prove to be the most relevant fact in the entire case." Mercer drew a breath. The letter disturbed him greatly. After reading it, he locked it away and instructed me that no one was to be admitted to the study under any circumstances. "And yet," Holmes said, "someone entered." Mercer shook his head. "I saw no one." Holmes closed the panel once more.
Perhaps not," he said, "but someone did, and they brought with them both a message and a mechanism." He turned toward Lestrade. "Inspector, we must now consider that the crime was not merely prepared, but anticipated. The letter, the device, the altered timeline, all point to a plan set in motion before this afternoon. And Mercer? Lestrade asked. Holmes glanced once more at the shaken secretary. Whether he is a participant or merely a pawn, he said quietly, we shall soon discover, but for the moment I am inclined to believe that the true author of this design has yet to reveal himself. As we left the study once more, I felt the tension tighten perceptibly. The circle of suspicion had not narrowed, it had deepened, drawing us towards something concealed not only in action, but in intent. And Holmes, I could see, I was now pursuing not merely the facts of the case, but the mind that had arranged them. Holmes did not immediately leave the passage as I had expected. Instead, he paused once more, his attention fixed upon the closed study door, as though weighing whether the truth lay more readily behind us than ahead. At this stage, he said quietly, we possess method, partial sequence, and fragments of motive, but no certainty as to the hand that unites them. Lestrade folded his arms. We have a man who returns to the scene, a note addressed to him, and a concealed device he claims not to know. That is more than fragments. It is more than fragments, Holmes agreed, but less than proof. And I have yet to encounter a criminal who constructed so elaborate a design only to betray himself by so crude an error. Then you still doubt Mercer? I doubt the simplicity of his guilt, Holmes replied. He moved toward the hall, then stopped abruptly. There is one element we have not yet properly examined, he continued. The letter. The one Lord Ashbourne received this morning, I said. Precisely. It disturbed him, was immediately secured, and has since vanished, along with the document that once lay upon his desk. It is, I suspect, the pivot upon which the entire affair turns. Lestrade nodded. Then we must find it. Holmes' eyes gleamed faintly. Or determine who needed it removed. We returned once more to the study, though this time Holmes did not concern himself with the obvious features of the room. Instead, he moved directly to the desk and began a far more intrusive examination, opening drawers, testing compartments, and running his fingers along the inner edges with a delicacy that suggested long familiarity with concealed mechanisms. At length, he paused. Ah, what is it? I asked. Without replying, Holmes pressed inward upon the back panel of a shallow drawer. There came a faint click, and a narrow inner compartment slid open, revealing a small, empty space. Lestrade swore softly. Hidden storage. And recently emptied, Holmes added. Note the absence of dust, the slight abrasion along the edges. Something was kept here and removed not long ago. The letter? I said. Almost certainly. Holmes closed the compartment and stood upright. Now consider, he continued, the sequence as it must truly have occurred. Our Lord Ashbourne receives a letter which disturbs him. He secures it here. At some point thereafter, another person gains access to this room, whether by invitation or deception, and removes it. And kills him, Lestrade said. Not necessarily in that order, Holmes replied. The inspector frowned. You think the letter was taken before the murder? I think, said Holmes, that the removal of the letter was the primary objective, and the murder either a consequence or a necessity. He moved slowly around the desk, his gaze thoughtful. If the letter contained information of sufficient importance, then its possession would confer advantage. But if Lord Ashbourne refused to relinquish it or threatened to act upon its contents, then his death becomes explicable. Then the murderer came for the letter, I said. Cowan used the device to conceal the true time of death. Exactly. Lestrade tapped the desk impatiently. Then who knew of the letter? The daughter, the secretary, the colonel? All three, perhaps, Holmes said. Or none. Knowledge of the letter's existence need not have been widely shared. It may have been inferred. At that moment, a firm tread sounded in the hall, and Colonel Rook entered without ceremony, his expression dark. "I've had enough of this," he said bluntly. "You've been prowling about the house for over an hour. Are we to be informed of anything, or are we all to remain under suspicion indefinitely?" Holmes regarded him calmly. "You are under no more suspicion than anyone else, Colonel." "That is not reassuring." "Truth rarely is." Rook snorted. "Because then perhaps you will tell us what you have found." Holmes studied him for a moment, then spoke with deliberate clarity. "I have found that the events of this afternoon did not occur in the order in which they have been presented. The voice heard at 2 was not Lord Ashbourne's. It was produced by a mechanical device concealed within this room." Rook stared at him. "That's absurd." "On the contrary, it is demonstrable." Holmes gestured toward the bookcase, but did not open it. "The purpose of that device was to create the illusion that Lord Ashbourne was alive at a time when he may already have been dead." Rook's expression hardened. "And what are you implying?" "I imply nothing as yet. I state only that the timeline has been manipulated." The Colonel took a step forward. Then one of us is supposed to have set up this contraption, without being seen, without leaving a trace." Holmes' eyes did not leave his face. "Without leaving an obvious trace," he said. A tense silence followed. Rook's gaze shifted briefly toward the desk, then back to Holmes. "This is madness," he said. "You are chasing phantoms." "Am I?" Holmes replied softly. "Then perhaps you can assist me by answering a simple question." "What question?" Holmes's voice dropped slightly. "What was contained in the letter Lord Ashbourne received this morning?" For the briefest instant, the Colonel's composure faltered. "I have no idea," he said. "None at all?" "None." Holmes inclined his head. "Curious." Rook's jaw tightened. "Why?" "Because," said Holmes, "you are the only person in this house who has not yet mentioned it, and the only one who appears disturbed by its existence." The Colonel's eyes flashed. "I am disturbed by insinuation, Mr. Holmes, not by letters." Holmes said nothing. He merely watched him. At length, Rook turned sharply and strode from the room. Lestrade exhaled. "Well, that was telling." "Yes," Holmes murmured, "though not in the way you suppose." He turned back to the desk, his expression once more composed. "The circle tightens," he said. "But we must proceed with care. The letter is gone, the timeline altered, and the witnesses unknowingly misled. What remains is to determine who had both the knowledge and the necessity to bring these elements together." "And you have a suspect?" I asked. Holmes glanced at me, and there was a quiet intensity in his gaze. I have," he said. "A pattern. And patterns, Watson, when properly understood, lead not merely to actions, but to intentions." He moved toward the door. "Come. There is one more point we must clarify before the design reveals itself entirely, and I suspect it lies not in what has been said, but in what has been deliberately left unsaid." Holmes led us not back into the principal rooms, but instead toward the front of the house, where a tall window overlooked the long drive by which we had arrived. He drew aside the curtains slightly and gazed out into the thickening fog, his expression distant yet intent, as though the shifting vapour itself might contain the final arrangement of his thoughts. "There is a point," he said after a pause, "at which a case ceases to be a collection of facts and becomes a question of character. We are approaching that point now." Lestrade shifted beside him. "Then you have narrowed it down." "I have narrowed the possibilities," Holmes replied. "But to distinguish between them, we must understand not only what each person could have done, but what each would have done. He turned from the window. Let us review briefly. A letter arrives in the morning, disturbing enough to alter Lord Ashbourne's behaviour. It is secured in a hidden compartment. At some point thereafter, someone enters this room, removes the letter, and either kills Lord Ashbourne or finds him already in a vulnerable position. And then arranges the illusion, I said. Precisely. The mechanical device, the arrested clock, the locked door, all serve to impose a false sequence upon the events. Lestrade frowned. But the question remains, who had the opportunity to do all that without being observed? Holmes nodded. And equally important, who had the time? He began to pace slowly. The device was not constructed in haste. It required preparation, adjustment, testing. That implies prior access to the room, perhaps over several days. It was not brought in at the moment of the crime. It was already in place. That would suggest someone within the household, I said. Or someone with unrestricted access to it, Holmes corrected. He stopped pacing. Now consider the letter. Its removal was not an afterthought, it was the central objective. The rest of the arrangement exists to obscure the moment at which that removal occurred. Lestrade looked thoughtful. Then the murderer needed time before the supposed moment of death. Exactly, and therefore, anyone whose alibi depends upon the belief that Lord Ashbourne was alive at 20 minutes past 2 must be re-examined. At that moment, a soft footstep sounded behind us. We turned to see Miss Eleanor Ashbourne standing in the doorway. She had evidently approached quietly, and though her composure remained outwardly intact, there was a new tension in her expression. "Mr. Holmes," she said, "I beg your pardon for overhearing, but I cannot remain idle while these suspicions linger. You speak of alibis and deception. Do you believe someone in this house, someone close to my father, was responsible?" Holmes regarded her with grave courtesy. "I believe, Miss Ashbourne, that the truth lies within this house. Whether it implicates those close to your father is a question I do not yet answer, but one I must not ignore." She stepped forward. Then I ask you, what was in the letter?" Holmes paused. "That, I fear, is precisely what someone wished to prevent us from discovering." Her hands tightened slightly. "My father had many dealings, legal, financial, even political. Could it have concerned any of those?" "It could have concerned any of them or something more personal," Holmes said. She hesitated, then spoke in a lower voice. "There was one matter. A dispute of sorts, though my father seldom spoke of it openly. It involved Colonel Rook." Lestrade glanced sharply at her. "In what way?" "I do not know the details," she replied. "Only that they had once been close friends, and that something occurred years ago which caused a breach between them. Recently, however, the Colonel had resumed his visits." Holmes' eyes narrowed slightly. "And your father welcomed this renewal?" "I cannot say. He tolerated it." Holmes inclined his head. "That is most useful, Miss Ashbourne." She looked from one to the other of us. "You suspect him, then?" "I suspect," Holmes replied, "that the past has a way of asserting itself at the most inconvenient moments." After she had withdrawn, Lestrade spoke at once. "Well, that settles it, if you ask me. Motive, opportunity, and a history between them." Holmes shook his head slowly. "It suggests a possibility, but it does not settle it. We must be wary of conclusions that arrive too readily." "Then what are we missing?" I asked. Holmes did not answer at once. Instead, he returned to the window and again looked out into the fog. "The timing," he said at last. "Always the timing." He turned back toward us. "Tea, the message delivered to Mercer, marked 2 o'clock. The voice heard at 20 minutes past. the discovery at past. Each element reinforces the same constructed sequence, but there is a discrepancy, one so subtle that it has thus far escaped notice. Lestrade frowned. What discrepancy? Holmes's expression sharpened. The interval. Between what? Between the supposed time of death and the discovery, Holmes said. If Lord Ashbourne was alive at 2 and dead by 30, then the window for the crime is 10 minutes. Yet within that time, the murderer would have had to enter, commit the act, arrange the body, secure the room, and depart unseen. Lestrade's eyes widened slightly. That would be difficult. Not merely difficult, impractical, Holmes said. Especially when we consider the additional time required to manipulate the clock and ensure the proper functioning of the device. Then the crime must have occurred earlier, I said. Precisely. And therefore the true window lies before past 2, not after it. Holmes stepped closer, his voice low and deliberate. Which means that whoever committed the crime must have had both access to the room and freedom of movement during that earlier period, before the illusion was activated. Lestrade drew a sharp breath. Then the alibis collapse entirely. Holmes gave a slight nod. And with them, the false sequence upon which they depend. He turned toward the corridor leading back to the study. We are very close now, he said. The pattern is complete. Only one element remains to be placed, and when it is, the entire design will resolve itself. I felt a curious mixture of anticipation and unease as we followed him. There was a certainty in his manner which I had learned to trust, but also to fear, for it often heralded a revelation both decisive and unsettling. And what is that final element? I asked. Holmes paused at the threshold of the study and looked back at me. The moment, he said quietly, at which the murderer believed himself to be unobserved. And with that he stepped inside, as though about to confront not merely the facts of the case, but the mind that had shaped them. The study, when we re-entered it, seemed no longer merely a chamber of death, but a carefully arranged theatre in which each object bore silent witness to a deception now on the verge of exposure. Then Holmes closed the door behind us with quiet deliberation and stood for a moment, as though aligning the final pieces of his reasoning before giving them voice. "Inspector," he said at last, "I must ask that you have Mr. Mercer, Colonel Rook, and Miss Ashbourne all brought here at once." Lestrade looked at him sharply. "You are ready, then?" "I am ready to test the truth," Holmes replied. "Whether it will confirm itself or resist is another matter." Within minutes, the three were assembled. Mercer entered pale and strained, his eyes darting uneasily about the room. Colonel Rook followed with a heavy tread, his expression set and defiant. Miss Ashbourne came last, composed but visibly tensed, her gaze moving at once to her father's still form before settling upon Holmes. Holmes stood beside the desk, one hand resting lightly upon its edge.
I thank you all for attending," he began. "The circumstances are grave, and I shall therefore speak plainly. The sequence of events as it has been presented to us is false." A murmur passed among them, but Holmes raised a hand. The voice heard at past 2 was not that of Lord Ashbourne. It was produced by a concealed mechanical device designed to create the illusion that he was alive at that moment. Mercer's breath caught audibly. Miss Ashbourne's face paled, though she did not speak. Colonel Rook's eyes narrowed. "That is a bold claim," he said. "It is a demonstrable fact," Holmes replied evenly. "And it serves a clear purpose, to shift the perceived time of death forward, thereby establishing alibis which would not otherwise hold." Lestrade stepped forward, his gaze moving from one to the other. "In other words,
Or one of you has attempted to deceive us." Holmes inclined his head slightly. not merely deceive, but to impose a false logical sequence upon the case, a most ingenious attempt, but one which fails when examined closely. He turned slightly, gesturing toward the desk. Let us consider what we now know. Lord Ashbourne received a letter this morning, one which disturbed him sufficiently to secure it in a hidden compartment. That letter has since been removed. Its removal was the primary objective of the intruder. Miss Ashbourne spoke, her voice controlled but strained. You believe my father was killed for that letter? I believe, Holmes said, that the letter contained information of such importance that its possession was worth killing for or silencing to protect. He turned then to Mercer. You, Mr. Mercer, all were aware of the letter's existence. Mercer swallowed. Only that it had arrived. I did not know its contents. And yet you received a message at 2 o'clock urging immediate action. I did not act upon it. No, Holmes said quietly. You did not, which is why you are still alive. The words seemed to strike Mercer with visible force. Holmes turned now to Colonel Rook. And you, Colonel, you had a history with Lord Ashbourne. A dispute, unresolved, and recently renewed by your presence in this house. Rook's jaw tightened. If you are accusing me— I'm not yet accusing, Holmes interrupted. I am arranging. He began to pace slowly. The crime, as we now understand it, must have occurred before 20 minutes past 2. The device was then activated to produce the illusion of continued life. The clock was arrested to reinforce that illusion. The room was secured, and the letter, already taken, was removed from the house. He stopped. The question, therefore, is this. Who had both the opportunity to enter this room before that time and the necessity to remove the letter? A silence followed, heavy and expectant. Holmes's gaze moved from one face to another, then came to rest, not upon Mercer nor upon the Colonel, but upon Miss Eleanor Ashbourne. Miss Ashbourne, he said gently, you were the last person to see your father alive. She met his gaze steadily. Yes. And you were also the one who discovered him? Yes. Holmes inclined his head. You had unrestricted access to this room. You knew your father's habits. You would not have been challenged in entering or leaving. Lestrade shifted uneasily.
Holmes, surely. Holmes raised a hand, his eyes never leaving hers. I do not accuse lightly, he said. But I must ask, what did your father's letter contain? For a moment she said nothing. Then slowly her composure began to crack. You cannot know that, she said. On the contrary, Holmes replied softly. I believe I can infer it. The letter concerned not merely a dispute, but a revelation. Something from the past, something involving Colonel Rook, and by extension yourself. Rook started. What nonsense is this? Holmes turned to him briefly. A matter of inheritance, perhaps, or legitimacy. Something that, if exposed, would alter the standing of this household. Miss Ashbourne's hands trembled now. You must stop, she said. Holmes's voice remained calm, but there was an unmistakable firmness in it. It's your father intended to act upon that letter, to disclose its contents or to use them. You confronted him. There was an argument in that moment whether by design or impulse you inflicted the wound. No, she cried. But the denial lacked force. Holmes continued inexorable. The act itself was swift, the wound precise, suggesting not rage but control. You then removed the letter, knowing its significance, but you also knew that suspicion would fall upon you unless the timeline could be altered. He gestured toward the bookcase. The device, already in place, perhaps constructed with assistance or knowledge gained over time, provided the means. You activated it, creating the illusion of your father's voice at 20 minutes past 2. You ensured that others would hear it. You returned later to discover the body, the door locked.
Are the sequence intact? Miss Ashbourne stood very still now, her face pale as marble. And the message to Mercer? Lestrade asked. Holmes nodded slightly. A final misdirection, sent to draw suspicion toward him, to suggest that he, not you, had been urged to act at the critical moment. The room was utterly silent. At last, Miss Ashbourne spoke, her voice scarcely above a whisper. He was going to destroy everything, she said. Holmes did not reply. He told me, she continued, that the truth must come out, that it could not be concealed any longer, that I must accept it. Her eyes flickered toward Colonel Rook. That my life, everything I believed, was built upon a lie. Rook stared at her in stunned silence. I could not allow it, she said. I would not. Lestrade stepped forward slowly. Miss Ashbourne. She raised a hand,
as though to ward him off. I did not plan it, she said. But when I saw the letter, when I understood what it meant, I knew he would act, and I could not let him. Her gaze fell upon her father's body. I only meant to stop him. Holmes's voice, when he spoke, was very quiet. And so you stopped everything. Lestrade placed a hand upon her arm. I must ask you to come with me, Miss Ashbourne. She did not resist. As she was led from the room, the silence she left behind seemed heavier than before, not with mystery now, but with the weight of its resolution. Holmes remained where he stood, his expression unreadable. The sequence, he said at last, has been restored. And yet, as I looked upon him, I could not help but feel that this victory of logic had come at a cost that no reasoning could entirely reconcile.
And for some moments after Miss Ashbourne's removal, none of us spoke. The study, which had so recently been the scene of intellectual contest, now seemed burdened by a more human gravity, one that no deduction, however precise, could entirely dispel. Colonel Rook stood as if struck motionless, his face ashen beneath its weathered hardness. His eyes remained fixed upon the doorway through which she had passed, as though unable to reconcile what he had heard with the woman he believed he knew. "This is madness," he muttered at last, though without conviction. "There must be some mistake." Holmes regarded him steadily. "There is no mistake, Colonel, only the truth, revealed in its proper order." Rook turned sharply. "You speak of order, yet you have torn apart a family with it." Holmes did not flinch. "I have done nothing but restore the sequence of events as they occurred. What that sequence reveals is not of my making." The Colonel's hands clenched at his sides. "And the letter? You claim it held some secret, some revelation. What was it?" Holmes hesitated briefly, then spoke. "The letter, I believe, concerned your past, specifically your connection to Miss Ashbourne. It is highly probable that it contained evidence that she was not Lord Ashbourne's daughter, but yours." Rook staggered slightly, as though the ground had shifted beneath him. "That is impossible," he said hoarsely. "Is it?" Holmes replied. "You and Lord Ashbourne were once close. A breach occurred, one never publicly explained. You returned recently, perhaps because that past had resurfaced. The letter confirmed it."
Lord Ashbourne intended to act, perhaps to acknowledge the truth, perhaps to alter his will. Rook sank into a chair, his strength seemingly gone. "She knew?" he whispered. "Yes," said Holmes, "and it was that knowledge which drove her to act." A long silence followed. The fire in the grate had sunk lower still, and the room seemed to darken as though in sympathy with the tragedy it contained. Lestrade re-entered at last, his expression grave. "She is in custody," he said quietly. "She has made a full statement. Holmes inclined his head. Then the matter is formally concluded. Lestrade glanced about the room. It is a strange business. I have seen men kill for money, for revenge, for fear, but rarely for something so intangible. For identity, Holmes said. Few motives are more powerful. The inspector nodded slowly.
And the device, the clock, the whole arrangement, it was all to buy time. To preserve a version of reality, Holmes corrected. One in which the truth did not yet exist. Lestrade gave a faint, weary smile. Well, you have undone it thoroughly enough. He took up his hat. I shall have the apparatus removed and the room secured. There will be statements to take, reports to file, the usual machinery. Holmes made no reply, and after a moment Lestrade withdrew once more, leaving us alone. I turned to my friend. You anticipated this, did you not? I said. Not the exact form, perhaps, but the direction. Holmes moved slowly to the window and looked out into the night, where the fog had begun, at last, to thin. I anticipated, he said, that the solution would lie not in complexity but in contradiction. How the case presented itself as an impossibility, a break in logical sequence. Such things do not exist. Therefore the sequence itself must have been falsified. And the rest followed. Piece by piece, he said. The device revealed the false voice. The clock revealed the imposed time. The missing letter revealed the motive. And the human element, always the most variable, revealed the hand. I joined him at the window. And yet, I said, there is something deeply unsatisfactory in it. Holmes glanced at me. You refer to the outcome? Yes. Justice, perhaps, but at the cost of everything else. Holmes was silent for a moment. Justice, he said at last, is not concerned with comfort, Watson. It is concerned with truth, and the two are not always compatible. I could not help but reflect upon Miss Ashbourne's final expression, neither defiant nor broken, but something in between, as though she had stepped beyond both guilt and innocence into a realm where neither held meaning. And the Colonel? I asked. He must now confront a truth long deferred, Holmes replied. Whether he does so with dignity or despair is a matter beyond our influence. We stood in silence for a time, watching as the first faint suggestion of dawn began to lighten the horizon beyond the trees. The oppressive weight that had hung over the house seemed to lift, if only slightly, as the fog retreated. At length, Holmes turned away. Come, Watson, our work here is done. And the case? I said. Holmes took up his coat and hat. The case, he said, is resolved, and the sequence has been restored, the illusion dispelled, and the truth, however unwelcome, laid bare. He paused, then added with a faint, almost ironic smile. And we are reminded once again that it is not the breaking of logic that confounds us, but the ease with which we accept it when it suits our expectations. As we stepped out into the cold morning air, I could not help but feel that, though the mystery had been solved, its deeper implications would linger far longer than any ordinary case. For in unravelling the crime, Holmes had done more than restore order. He had revealed how fragile that order could be when perception itself was manipulated, and that perhaps was the most unsettling truth of all. The journey back to Baker Street passed in near silence, broken only by the rhythmic clatter of the carriage wheels against the dampened stones. The fog, which had so long obscured both the city and the truth we pursued, had begun to lift, revealing London in its cold and indifferent clarity. Yet my thoughts remained behind within that house where logic had triumphed, but not without cost. Holmes sat opposite me, his long fingers loosely interlaced, his gaze fixed upon nothing in particular. To the casual observer, he might have appeared detached, even indifferent. But I knew him too well. Beneath that stillness, his mind was not at rest. It was reflecting, refining, and perhaps judging. "It is curious, Watson," he said at last, "how often the most intricate cases resolve themselves not through complexity, but through the exposure of a single false premise." "You refer to the time of death," I said. "To the assumption of it," he corrected. Once we accepted that Lord Ashbourne was alive at 20 minutes past 2, every subsequent deduction was constrained by that belief. The entire structure of the case rested upon it, and therefore the entire deception depended upon its acceptance. And the mechanical device ensured that acceptance. Precisely, a most elegant solution, simple in principle, yet profound in its effect. It did not create impossibility, it merely redirected certainty. I considered this. "And yet, Holmes," I said, "even had the illusion succeeded, could it have endured? Would not some inconsistency have emerged?" Holmes gave a faint smile. "Undoubtedly, but not before suspicion had settled firmly upon the wrong individual. Our Mr. Mercer, for example, was already positioned to bear the weight of it, the message, the opportunity, his evident anxiety. A few more hours, perhaps a day, and the case might have closed itself around him entirely. And Miss Ashbourne would have escaped." "For a time," Holmes said. "But the truth has a tendency to reassert itself, however deeply it is buried. In this instance, it required only that we question the sequence itself." The carriage slowed as we approached Baker Street, and within moments we had returned to our familiar rooms. Mrs. Hudson, ever attentive, had already prepared the fire, and its warmth was a welcome contrast to the chill of the morning. Holmes removed his coat and moved at once to the mantel, where he stood gazing into the flames. "There remains one final consideration," he said, "and that is—" "The letter." "You believe it will be recovered?" Holmes shook his head slightly. "I believe it has already served its purpose, and was likely destroyed shortly thereafter. Its contents, however, have been sufficiently inferred. The truth it contained has already manifested in action." "Then it was the catalyst, but not the evidence?" "Exactly." He turned, his expression thoughtful. "It is a curious thing, Watson, how often in such cases the physical object, the letter, the weapon, the mechanism, draws our attention, while the true force lies in the human response to it. The letter did not kill Lord Ashbourne. It merely revealed something that made his death inevitable." I took a seat opposite him. "And Miss Ashbourne?" I asked. "What do you suppose will become of her?" Holmes's gaze lowered slightly. "That will depend upon many factors. Her statement, the circumstances, perhaps even the discretion of those involved. There are cases where the law is clear, and others where it must contend with the complexities of human motive." "You feel some sympathy for her?" Holmes did not answer at once. "I feel," he said at last, "an understanding of the forces that led her to act. Sympathy is another matter." There was no harshness in his tone, only a quiet finality. I leaned back, reflecting upon the chain of events, the letter, the device, the broken sequence, and its careful restoration. "It is remarkable," I said, "that the entire illusion rested upon so small a detail, a voice heard through a door." Holmes's eyes glinted faintly. "Not the voice, Watson, the expectation of it. That is where the true deception lay. The mind, once convinced of a pattern, resists all contradiction. It fills in gaps, resolves ambiguities, and defends its conclusions, even against evidence." He reached for his violin, turning it thoughtfully in his hands. "In this case, the crime did not break logical sequence. It exploited our faith in it." "And you restored it?" Holmes shrugged lightly. "I merely removed what did not belong." He raised the violin and drew the bow across the strings, producing a low, contemplative note that seemed to echo the quiet resolution of the case. "The world," he continued, "is rarely as orderly as we believe, but neither is it chaotic. Between those extremes lies the domain of reason, and it is there that we must always operate." I smiled faintly. "And what of the next case?" Holmes allowed himself the faintest trace of amusement. "My dear Watson, I have no doubt that it will present itself soon enough, quite possibly under circumstances equally determined to defy explanation." The music rose then, soft and measured, filling the room with a sense of calm that stood in stark contrast to the turmoil we had so recently left behind. And as I sat there, listening, I could not help but feel that though the mystery had been resolved, its deeper lesson would remain with me always, that logic, however precise, is only as reliable as the assumptions upon which it is built. And that, in the hands of a clever mind, even reality itself may be made to appear otherwise, until at last it is set right once more,